welcome to the Virtual CMO Podcast. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you so much for having me.
So it's exciting. We're going to get a chance to talk about the law today, which is not a topic we cover a lot here on the podcast, but I think it's so applicable to business owners. And so I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit today. But first, I've got to ask, I know you're over in the UK, and
yes,
you guys have this odd habit of wearing white wigs in court. Tell me a little bit about the history and why do you still do that?
Okay, so white wigs are actually for criminal courts only. And it's a tradition that goes back too many hundred years for me to know exactly when it started. I have to be honest. But it's only run in criminal courts and not in civil courts. And the reason behind it, and we actually spoke about this on a podcast ourselves, is because when you're representing one of the reasons, when you're representing somebody and just say that you're representing the state and you have the criminal on the other side, you could come out of court and if they see you or recognize you and if they're free walking and they think, hey, it's you're the person that tried to have me convicted or whatever or fighting against me, but with the wig, you're supposed to look completely different. So when you come out of court and you rip off the wig, you're a different human being and nobody's supposed to recognize you.
That's very interesting. I mean, I love it. I think one of the reasons that as Americans, we tend to love coming over to London, it's all the pomp and the circumstance and the traditions of a lot of those old school things. And that is definitely one that still exists in the criminal justice system.
Indeed. There's certainly lots of old school things here in London, in England.
So I've got to ask, we are in this world right now where people just love to sue people. And as a business owner, it's something that you really have to be on the lookout for. How did we get to this point, do you think, where everybody wants to sue everybody about everything?
Being litigious. Well, I have to say, if you don't mind me saying, and before I do say, I will say I'm a big fan of America and Americans, but this is a sort of American attitude in a little way, in some way, because over here, the British are still quite conservative. And for example, you can't sue for your feelings, for the pain and the strain and the upset here in the UK. And I often do say in my job, I wish we were in America, because in America, you can. And the fact that your feelings have been hurt or you've been mentally scarred by an event. And I think one of the most memorable events for me in America is when a guy sued McDonald's for burning his lips at drinking a hot cup of coffee. And he got a substantial sum of money because he said, I am now scarred for life about, over that incident, and I can't drink cups of coffee. And here you just wouldn't get that. So I think that America's really opened the way and led the way in us being able to think of points to sue other people over, and the elements of that. And the UK is still catching up with that. But yeah.
I think we're going to enter a period here of a lot of litigation as businesses have closed because of the COVID pandemic. There's a big debate here in the States right now with some of these government support packages about limiting the liability of businesses because somebody could sue, especially a wealthy, strong business, to say, well, I picked up COVID while, attending your store or, your theme park or whatever it may be. So this has really been crazy, right? And I think a lot of businesses didn't expect not to be covered for some of these losses. There was no pandemic coverage in their policies. How do you think this is going to change businesses going forward?
Well, I think there's a few things there really, Eric. And one of the things is that, I think the lawyers are going to be busier than ever. Let's put it that way. I think that's a given, right? Because most people are going to have an angle at some form of litigation, whether you're the business owner or whether you're the actual consumer. In terms of how is the landscape likely to change as a result of COVID? Well, God, we often mention, the new normal, or when we get back to normal. We say when we get back to normal, and this is our new normal. I don't think we're going to know a new normal for a very, very long time. And one of the points that, you raised, which I have to say very early on into lockdown, I came to realize that business insurance policies, the majority of business insurance policies, were not covering pandemic as a result of pandemic losses and pandemics. I just couldn't believe it. I just thought, this is shocking. How can an insurance policy saying we're here to make sure that you're going to be okay, should there be any reasonable problem, how can they not cover a business that's been ordered by the government to close? So they haven't chosen to close their doors, although most people probably and likely would have to safeguard themselves against the coronavirus and to safeguard their customers. But the government's ordered it. So I just think it's a really shoddy way for insurers to kind of slither out of this whole thing. Some insurers are paying. Some insurers are paying out. Very, very few, but some are. And I would say to businesses, really, insurance policies are going to be up for renewal. And when that time comes, really scrutinize your policy and maybe even try to find a policy that will cover a pandemic, because there's lots of talk about a second wave and all this might not go away after a vaccine because our bodies might become immune to this vaccine, and then all may happen again. So I would say if there is an insurance policy available that would cover a pandemic, and I do think the landscape of insurance policies are going to change as a result of this as well, because of the huge amount of insurance companies have come under scrutiny and already legal action as to why they're not covering businesses for their loss of earnings and their damages. I mean, like you say, there's a huge amount of businesses that will be closing their doors for business forever as a result of the pandemic.
This is such an interesting conversation to me, and I'd love to dive a little bit deeper in it, because it just seems like one thing is piling on top of another. So especially here in the States, but I know around the world as well, there has been some civil unrest too. Here in the States, we've had the George Floyd incident, the Black Lives Matter, but we've seen, recently in France, there have been the labor strikes and whatnot. But civil unrest is something that is often covered by insurance policies, correct? If there is a demonstration in the street and somebody breaks your windows or steals something from your store, that's different. That's usually covered, correct?
Yes. I mean, usually that sort of thing is covered. I mean, if you had an accidental fire in a location, in an office building, in a shop, in a retail shop, you're covered. You're covered for the losses. And what they do is they will take your business accounts and they'll say, what did you turn over in the last year? What was your average profit, monthly profits in the last year? And that's what we'll pay out, plus the recovery cost of putting everything back to normal for you to recover. So you see that the crucial thing here is that really, I feel like insurers have just gotten away with it, because the government orders a lockdown, right? So it's completely out of the control of the actual business owner, regardless of the reason. And the pandemic is the reason. But regardless of that, you're being asked to lock down. Actually, if you think about it, and some policies are very interesting, because it says in some policies, it gives a distance to where the pandemic has to be to your business. So I've read insurance policies that say if there is a pandemic and a disease, and those words are used in some policies, that is within 100 meters of your place of business, the front doors of your offices or your shop, then we will not be able to cover you. Well, actually, where is the pandemic and the disease? You can't categorically say it's 100 feet from where you're sitting now, Eric, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So it's the legal system, in my view, at its best. They take the words and they mince them up and they interpret them in a way which is in favor of insurers. And let's face it, most insurers, most of their business is actually, how do we not pay out? How do we protect ourselves against that? They spend more money, more time, more legal expertise on getting their policies to a point where they're tight and they're not exposed to claims than they do actually to pay out claims.
It's been an issue that we've dealt with a lot. So I live in Florida. We have storms. There was just one that crossed the states today as we're recording this. So it moved through the Gulf or the Atlantic and up the coast, and it ended up hitting New York. and that area with high winds. But here again, we get into all these technicalities of storms, right? If a storm comes through and it blows off my roof and my house gets flooded with rain, that's covered. If the storm comes through and overwhelms a dam and the water comes spilling out over the dam and my house gets flooded, it's the same storm, but that's a flood. And one is, wind damage. So it's covered under a different policy. So you need to have flood insurance for this kind of scenario. You need to have hurricane insurance for this kind of scenario. But if it's not a named storm, then it's a different kind of there are a lot of permutations to it's hard for businesses to know. And I can imagine it gets awfully expensive too if you have to stack all of these riders on these policies to cover any scenario. So what does a business do?
Well, I mean, this is the thing, because the one thing that may happen is that when it comes to renewal time, if the pressure is on the insurers to include pandemics and a loss of business as a result of a pandemic, the policies then might be a lot more expensive to take out. And they may be, it's a typical thing. And we usually find that with health insurance here. Oh, here's the basic package. And you think, wow, that's expensive. But if you want this cancer care cover, and if you want hospitalization cover, and then it goes up and up and up. And I'm sure it's the same in the US with private healthcare. When you add all the bits on, by the time you come out the other side, you think, wow, that's really expensive. But people are going to be seriously considering, I think, pandemic cover if it's going to be offered. And I think, there's no right or wrong here. We can't sit here and judge whether there will be a second wave, whether there will be sufficient immunization available to the world at large so that we don't fall into this same category. I would just say, do your best to find out what policies you can find that will cover you for a pandemic, because, if another pandemic does happen and your government says you must close down, you must shut your shop, then that's the cover you're looking for. Because I don't think business are going to want to close their doors that easily. In fact, what I've seen are business owners desperate to get back to business, desperate to open their front doors for business, because the losses are just, they're just astronomical and phenomenal. And government assistance, as you mentioned earlier, it's going to be measured if it's going to be around at all, if this happens all again.
In the States here, we don't have a lot of employees that work under a contract. So if you're maybe part of a union or something like that, then there are specific contract terms that you work on. Potentially some higher level executives might be under some type of an employment contract, but your general, hourly worker at a restaurant is not under any kind of employment. A lot of states are at work at will states, so they can be fired really for any reason. But now we're also in a situation where the government has been supplying some businesses with payroll protection to keep people on the payroll during this. And I can see cases where employees sue employers for being let go, for being furloughed, because they don't feel that their termination was proper, that maybe somehow the business benefited from them in a way that was unlawful. Do you see this being a big part of litigation in the coming months as employees have to deal with furloughs, terminations, et cetera?
Well, let me tell you something, Eric. When I was doing some research for our podcast today, and I saw the figures of in excess of 40 million job losses in the US up until June 2020, my eyes popped out of my head and popped back in, because I just thought,
it's
goodness
crazy.
Gracious, that is a significant and rising. And at that time, and these figures are from June, and this was reported in The Guardian, and it's on The Guardian's website, guardian.com. In June, they were saying that the unemployment rate was rising by a rate of 2.1 million per week in the USA alone. Now, we sit there and we reel those figures off, of our tongues, but that's a serious, serious, serious number. And in the beginning of this podcast, I said that I think the lawyers and the legal system is going to be incredibly busy. One of the busiest areas, I think, is going to be employment law, because The way that furlough has been handled by businesses is, I don't think a lot of it has not been born out of, them just being nasty or horrible or something like that. And actually, some businesses are taking legal advice and still the wrong steps are being taken. It's out of desperation. If you had a choice and you had, say, 50 employees, and you said, if that 25 don't go today, if the payroll does not stop today for the 25, the other 25 won't survive it. It's out of sheer desperation and panic, because let's face it, our world has never been in a situation, not in my lifetime, been in a situation like this before. I don't think we've ever seen like this before in the modern working world that we have. So it's incredibly sad, but I do think that both employers and employees and staff are going to be scrabbling around to try and see what legal assistance they can get. What I would say to the employers and the businesses is get legal advice early. If you still haven't furloughed your staff, if you still haven't made redundancies, if you still haven't laid people off, get the advice early, because that can really, really, really prevent expensive and timely litigation. And as employees, now we have had a raft of employees here which have been laid off from companies that have just gone under, straight into liquidation, and some big names, some big corporate brands we're speaking about. So what the small guy, goodness, hats off to the small guy that does survive this.
Yes.
And they've come knocking on our door. Can you help legally? Can you help? Well, if the company's gone into liquidation, if it's folded, you're going after something that's got no money to pay you, even if a court finds you were laid off unfairly, it was unfair dismissal, or it was the employer didn't go through the correct consultation process, or they had you working while you were in furlough and you came out of furlough and then you were let go. If they don't exist anymore, who are you litigating for? Who's going to pay the sums that you're after in compensation? Big areas of consideration.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing here, and I think a potential problem for at least some of the larger companies, is if they have received some form of government assistance in order to support that payroll and then end up letting people go anyway, people are going to say, well, you took the money and then you're still letting people go. That was wrong. That wasn't part of the agreement. And I'm sure it's going to be a lot to keep the lawyers very busy.
Indeed. I think we have to sympathize with businesses here, because let's face it, before COVID-19, nobody could have envisaged what's happening, and everybody was in business, right? Doing what they were doing. I have, for a very long time in my adult life, have said that majority of businesses and people live paycheck to paycheck. If you didn't have a paycheck coming through the door next month, how many months could you survive as a business even, or as an individual in keeping everything going? So, I think one of the things that people have to give consideration to businesses that are having to let people go, are having to close the doors, is this is not what they would have wanted.
Yes.
This is not they didn't get up one day and say, right, okay, I think I'll just fold, or I'll just get rid of half my staff. It's not what they wanted. And, it comes down to really for businesses, it's survival. What do we need to do to survive if we can survive?
That's actually a great segue into another thing that I wanted to ask you about. So if I'm a business owner, I'm very much in that survival mode. I'm trying to figure out what can I do to hold on. And I've got contracts with vendors. Maybe I'm leasing some equipment, or I subscribe to some software services, or I have a lease for my office space or my restaurant or whatnot. How much leverage do businesses have to renegotiate those contracts?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Eric, because I think a lot of this is going to come down to the government guidelines, because the governments have stepped in, right, to say, okay, during this time, these are some temporary laws that we're putting into place to protect people with mortgages on their properties, with mortgage holidays, people, employers, employees, etc., by giving grants and help and assistance, etc. So I would say that if you have to renegotiate your rental or lease agreement for your premises, and that's probably one of the biggest issues that people are going to be facing, I have to tell you, I have spoken to a numerous amount of businesses who have said, luckily, our lease came to an end. We're not going back in. Goodness knows what the city in London's going to look like in terms of office space and things, because lots of people aren't even going back. But I would say that very early on, if you need to renegotiate because obviously you can't honor the payments, or maybe you don't need the flow of stock that you've committed to taking, or you're just not using the equipment, as you've said, if you've got equipment that's been given to you because you're not in the premises, on the premises, first of all, go back to the supplier, go back to the landlord, go back to the source in which you're in contract with, and try and negotiate that, at that point between you and them, before you get lawyers involved or anything like that, because you may find that they also, a landlord is still a business owner. A lease, providing your lease, providing your rent, the equipment, everybody you're speaking to is also in business. And they obviously, if they can try and salvage any of their business, they more than likely will do everything they can. So go back to source and try yourself to try and renegotiate your position. If you find that someone's going to, and this could be your landlord or the company that you've leased from, are going to just throw your contract at you and say, well, sorry, you're bound. There's some very key points here to consider. And I think one of them is, and I'm not talking about leases now, I think I'm referring more to equipment leasing and things like that. If you're not able to use the service as a result of not being able to operate, or they're not able to provide you with the service as a result of not being able to operate, then that contract is already in breach. So that's one thing to think about. So if a service provider can't provide you their service because they're delivering certain things to that premises, that's what they're contracted to do. Or it could be that, you have to turn up to a certain location to use a certain premises in a certain regular way. If you can't do that and they can't deliver, then that contract's already in breach. So that's one very important thing. But if you've gone to source, and let's take the landlord as the option here, and you said, look, really need to renegotiate terms, I can't afford to carry on. And, when I do get back in, or I'm back in now and business isn't as strong as I want it to be, because let's face it, I don't think anything's going to return back to what we knew it to be. And I think if we say 12 months, that's a pretty much safe bet. Here in the UK, offices already been told no one's going back into the offices until next year. So, that's 6-7 months from now. Yes. And then they'll be staggered, like 2 days a week, 3 days a week, etc. Then that's when you need to take legal advice, and you need to take it quickly. Don't sit on it. Don't fester on it, because that advice that you take early on, again, can assist you and keep you at bay from expensive and timely litigation. I don't think, actually, in my view, any judge or courtroom is going to find you unreasonable for trying to get out of a contract due to the pandemic, due to the fact that your business can't afford to contract in that way anymore, or your business cannot afford to stay in those premises. I don't think there's going to be, some sort of big penalization going on because you can't honor your part of that contract by paying for it, because judges and courts are going to have to take into consideration the situation that people are finding themselves in.
So just to drill into that a little bit more, I know businesses start to worry about the position that they're going to be in when they go and talk to a landlord, a leaseholder, or maybe a supplier, and keep putting it off. Well, let's see how we do, and let's see if we can fix this next month. Do you think you're in a much stronger negotiating position to go in before the problems get bad? Or do you think you're in a stronger position maybe when you're 90 days late on a payment and red flags are starting to show up at the vendor or the landlords and saying something's gone wrong here, let's see what we can do to salvage this relationship? Or do you think by that point they're already in panic mode thinking this is too late?
Actually, Eric, I think, I don't want to sound sort of good old legal shady about this, but quite frankly, I would say it's always good to speak before the problem has occurred, if you can. Because right now we are months into this pandemic. A lot of people have financially felt some pain, right? And as we've been saying, there's been some huge corporates having to close down business. Today, I read that Virgin USA is applying to the liquidators and all sorts of things. Virgin Atlantic. I mean, yes. Lots of stuff going on. So I would say try to have the conversations early as you can, because what you and document that, because you're saying, look, there's going to be a problem. This is what's coming in. It's not going to work for us to be in this position, having to contract with you at the price and the cost that we've committed to in 6 weeks and in 8 weeks' time. What can we do to prevent you losing me as a tenant, or whatever the situation may be, maybe reducing the service or reducing your rent, or having a deferred rent, a reduced and deferred lease repayments. Look at all options. And I mean, if you're going to shut shop, then again, that landlord or that lease person giving you a lease is a business as well. So I would say, if you can go, the earlier you can go, the better it is. Because if it goes wrong and you're not able to renegotiate with them and you do end up in a courtroom, by that time, the trouble probably would have been done, dusted and over. You would have been, because you're saying you're in trouble. If the landlord or the other side of the contract is not willing to assist you, then by the time you get to a courtroom, which will probably be months, maybe even a year or two ahead, because of the overload of work that the courts have to deal with and the closure of courts and the reopening, you probably would have been in and out, you're well through the trouble, it's over, sort of thing. But
I think that's really great advice for both sides of the business, because I know, for example, when the banks here were talking about mortgage forbearance, giving people a few months off from making payments, they went out of their way to say this isn't going to affect your credit. This isn't going to affect your standing with the bank. Don't be afraid to proactively seek this help if you need it. And I think that gave people a lot of comfort in saying, oh, I really can't pay this right now. Let me proactively do it, rather than getting behind on their payments and then having to basically go in a different workflow. So I think both the businesses need to be understanding that when people are coming to them asking for help, that this is their way of saying, we want to keep this relationship good. We value you and this relationship. Let's work together. And I think people have to, be proactive about expressing their problems as well. So one area I wanted to talk to you about as well is just general contracting within business. We're past the stage, I think, where a handshake deal is sufficient for a lot of things. Sometimes business goes bad. Somebody says they're going to do something, they don't do it. How often do you think it's worth a smaller business taking legal action for an unpaid debt, for a contract that's been broken? Is it worth going after everything on principle, or do you just say for some of these it's too small, it's not even worth the effort?
Always go after it, Derek.
Always go after it.
Commercially. So if it's commercially viable, and what I mean by that, in my opinion, is if you're going after $1,000 and it's going to cost you $2,000 in court fees and legal fees and lawyers' fees to do that, then there's no commerciality there. However, if your business is such that you've got an in-house lawyer who works for your business, so therefore you're not actually paying an outsourced and adding to the cost of the business, then anybody that's done wrong on a contract, if it's financially damaging to your business, surely you have to go after it, because it's business principle, really. But there has to be commerciality attached to it, because, there's too many people trying to take too many businesses for a ride. Sometimes that is the case, and I certainly feel that is the case. But then I also see too many businesses trying to take people for a ride, because they think, well, look at who we are. We've got money behind us. This is our policy. If you don't like it and you suffered a loss or you're an unhappy customer, then good luck to you, and go and get legal help if you want. And it goes both ways, and I think that contractually, if there's commerciality to your claim, i.e. you're not going after somebody who's not got the money to pay you. So it could be that somebody's breached a contract because they've gone bust or out of business or whatever. So you will be able to get the money you're going after if you're successful in your claim. And if the value of your claim does not outweigh the cost of actually going after the claim. The commerciality is really, really key, because, sometimes you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. There is that saying here where you think, oh my God, but I've spent so much money and the lawyers are now saying it's going to cost so much more. and we're arguing over $50,000, but I've spent $100,000. What I can't give up now.
Yes.
It's a bit like the casino floor, right? When you're on that roulette table, you're thinking, I've got to win this back somehow.
Yes.
I talk like a professional gambler, but really I'm not. So,
Well, I think this is just the kind of thing that businesses need to hear, because the law is often a little abstract, I think, for many businesses. They're worried about making a profit and keeping their people employed and suppliers and vendors and customers. The law sometimes gets lost in all that. And I know one of the ways that you help people is you've actually got a very popular podcast of your own. Talk to me a little bit about the podcast and the success it's had globally.
well, thank you, Eric. I mean, my podcast is a new brand. It's only been around for coming up to 8 months, and it's called Gets Legally Speaking. The US is actually our second biggest audience, and
That's great.
the UK is, yeah, I'm really pleased to say that. The UK is our biggest audience, and all we're doing actually is it's me speaking with, and here we have barristers and solicitors. So barristers are sort of the higher end of the legal spectrum. So it's me sitting down with barristers and judges on a one-to-one and just breaking down the law and bringing to the public, to the consumer, and it could be business owners, it could be just general consumers, employees, employers, legal conversation without the jargon. It's as simple as that. We're very, very honored and pleased to say that we are now in the top 2% of podcasts in the UK.
That's amazing.
That is really amazing. I didn't think that as an unknown person to my world, it would be so popular so quickly. And I'm really proud of that. And we just aim to give free legal conversation to people who in different areas of law, and it could be with business, it could be with divorce, it could be motoring law, employment law, employee law, it could be any area of law. We're the UK's number one, and we're going in the right direction for now.
I think that's great. And I wish you continued success with it, because, as I said, the law is an interesting topic, and getting the perspective of judges and lawyers, I think is really important, just to hear their perspective, because these are the people arguing the cases and ruling on the cases. So I think the format is great. And I will definitely have a link to that in the show notes so that people can find it. But I know it's available on Apple Podcasts and all the other podcast players of choice. This has been a really fascinating conversation, and I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for your time. Really.
This has been great. Thank you again.